My name's Jonathan Van Valin. I teach and speak and seek to put people in touch with their deepest being and live from the peace that pours forth from that.
What is the soul?
To me, the soul is a beautifully handy separation idea. It's an idea that says, I'm bigger than this simple, physical, individuated sense of self. And it expands that boundaries to something much bigger. As a soul, I can now travel perhaps in other dimensions and into other bodies and all kinds of adventures that simply being only a body couldn't possibly have afforded or be conceived. And so it's certainly and unquestionably a beautiful expansion of someone's awareness. And I would also suggest overwhelmingly that it still is also a separation idea in the sense that as a separate soul, I am still separate from perhaps these other souls. And so there can come a point in that journey, beautifully, where even that idea of separation can begin to dissolve into something that is unequivocally even more whole and one, without even that non-corporeal sense of separation in it.
What is the soul's relation to Source/God?
So this is where the distinction between the word soul and spirit becomes particularly rich to me, because as a separation idea, the notion of a soul still puts us as very separate from God or from the divine. Whereas if I'm thinking in terms of spirit, and spirit as being essentially another word for that fundamental oneness to begin with, then the relationship between spirit and God, those are essentially the same thing. And that it is the divine in its guise as spirit that can activate what we experience in this world. And so, again, that sense of that word spirit to me is much closer to that fundamental oneness than a word like soul.
Mind, body, or soul? Which is the real us?
We are absolutely love. It's something that every single one of us has experienced in some fashion, and surely is at the core of every bit of spiritual seeking or even any other kind of seeking that we've gone through. We get it a little jumbled up by being so caught by all the things that seem concrete, all the limitations of the body, sometimes even the limitations of the soul, and certainly all the things that we seem to encounter that seem to be the opposite of loving. It's been said by many, in many, many, many sources, that love is the opposite of fear. And there certainly can be virtually no question in anyone's experience, truly anyone, now or in the past or in the future, that doesn't have some experience of their own very directly in which they could recognize that when they were not feeling fearful was when it was most possible for them to connect with something that was loving.
Are human incarnations voluntarily chosen?
Our experiences are, in fact, voluntarily chosen from my perspective. However, there is a huge difference between my sort of waking, ordinary, walking around in this life, conscious awareness uh, that's very different from the level of mind on which those choices seem to have been made. And I would understand absolutely anyone because I would agree with it myself. There are so many things about this life myself that, from my ordinary, regular human point of view, boy, I wouldn't have chosen them either. And yet, here they are, and I can, in fact, at this point, look back and recognize a stunning, if subtle and deep way in which in the depths of that mind with a capital M, this was in fact a choice, not a choice born out of the kind of aware consciousness that we're used to trying to make decisions about what we want. In fact, those were choices made in a way and on a level that, first of all, this ordinary mind, daily mind, is generally not in touch with or aware of at all. But secondly, those choices were made out of a form of ignorance. And so when we say, I wouldn't have made that choice, well, of course you wouldn't. If you had understood the deepest truth at that time, in those moments in which time is impossible to measure anyways, well, you probably wouldn't have made that choice either. But in a utterly innocent and simply mistaken, unaware kind of way, it was like this wrong turn was taken. Which is why what we have as a task in this present life, then, is to simply redirect the error. And that's all. And that's not something that requires sacrifice necessarily, and pain and penance, and as some kind of punishment, which is what many people would describe some of their life to be like sometimes. It's just that there was an error in that way made, and so it is in this life that we still yet have this opportunity to redirect that seeming choice. And if any of this has anything to do with encouraging and helping someone to in fact redirect that choice into something kinder, gentler, then amen to that.
What's the purpose of life on the physical plane?
Simply to return to that fundamental oneness. And how do we do that? By being in touch with our deepest being. When we are in touch with our deepest being, which is that aspect of us that is in fact beyond this earth plane, then we have the opportunity to bring that perspective to this earth plane. And when we come from that perspective, that oneness, that wholeness, that place in which there is no sense of separation in it, if there is no sense of separation, then there cannot be any sense of there being a lack, because what is not separated is very whole. If it's very whole, it's very complete. If it's very complete, there cannot be any sense of lack or want or need. And it's in that sense that from that place there cannot be fear. And if there is no fear, then the most natural default setting then is something peaceful and loving. And so what is our job here on this planet? It's to gently redirect our minds in such a way that we can become in touch with that deepest being, and therefore come to this place that sometimes seems a little mad and crazy, from a place that is more loving, which again sort of redirects us and redirects our mind towards that fundamental oneness.
Do souls have more than one incarnation, either on Earth or elsewhere?
The question of whether reincarnation is a real thing is much to me like the question of what is a soul, or what's the difference between a soul and not a soul, or soul and spirit, or something like that. Because if out of sort of one side of, if I've said in some way that a soul is a separation idea, then there's no getting around the fact at all that reincarnation is also, in a sense, a form of a separation idea. But just like the fact that the idea of a soul can be very helpful and be a very powerful, important, helpful, meaningful step in someone's journey, so can then this notion of reincarnation. Because again, it says, it's not just this life, it's not just this body. Why, there have been many bodies, there have been many lives. And so it's really very much cut from the same cloth, this idea, reincarnation. I can relate myself to having vivid memories of a number of past lives. And, and that's been, in many ways, tremendously helpful. And so it is not an idea that is necessary to simply cast away for any reason at all. It can be a very helpful idea. It's just that, like that discussion about souls, it could also be said that there's also more to the story than just, is this a thing or is it not a thing? And in that sense, if everything is in fact ultimately one, and that separation at its most fundamental is not true, and that wholeness and oneness is the fundamental truth beyond the scope of dimension and bodies and souls and all of it, then it is also still true beyond even the notion of reincarnation. And so there can even become a point when looking upon those past lives is like looking upon this life and recognizing that my sense of separation in this life is no different than the sense of separation of having had many lives. And so even these kinds of limitations can begin to fall away until all that is left is that fundamental oneness.
Does the soul plan its incarnations ahead of time?
Does a soul plan its incarnations ahead of time? Oh, part of me just thinks like, oh, does it really matter if it does or doesn't? Here we are. Let's deal with what's in front of our nose. But this is very related to that kind of question of, did I choose this life? To me, it's essentially the same fundamental question. I think it's tricky on one hand because in every moment, regardless of what's in front of our face, we do still have some form of choice. And so whether we say we came into this situation at by the choice of our soul or not, there's always a way in which whatever we are experiencing, we have an opportunity to reinterpret. And that's why the fact that regardless of whether we're here because our soul chose this or not, there is still this opportunity to reinterpret our point of view. Am I going to come to this situation from that separated standpoint in which, or am I going to come from it from that standpoint that is underpinned by that overwhelming wholeness in which there is a lack of fear and that there is no sense of want or need, or that is that place that is fundamentally peaceful and loving. If I'm going to be able to come from that place, then whatever's happening in front of my nose, whether there was a sense of having chosen it or not chosen it, I'm probably going to navigate it much more gracefully. And that fear about being stuck or victimized by it can fade away of its own accord.
Do we have soul groups that we incarnate with across different lifetimes?
It certainly appears that we do. In the most simple terms, I can say in my own experience, I know that I have met some of the same people many times. But in that great illusory cycle, there does seem to be, we seem to go like schools of fish or planets revolving around each other a lot.
Are there contracts or agreements between souls?
There are, from that a certain level of perception, and particularly in the sense that all the people in our lives, when we meet them and interact with them, whether it's a short relationship or a long relationship or something like that, there's a way in which where they are in their spiritual journey is somehow a particularly good match for where you are in your spiritual journey. And that doesn't necessarily always mean that it's delightful. In fact, it may be even deeply antagonistic, but there's something about that relationship that is particularly acute in terms of each of those people's opportunities for developing and for opening these doorways to a return home.
Do spirit guides or angels assist us?
So, inner guidance is something that can come from absolutely any source. Sometimes people refer to it as their angels and their guides. Sometimes people refer to it simply as intuition. There are so many words across cultures for some form of an inner prompt, an inner guidance. And so whether we call it talking to God or talking to my guides or angels, in the end, it doesn't really matter what we call it or how we even conceptualize it, whether we conceptualize it as an individual figure in our mind's eye or simply as a generalized awareness or knowledge. And nor does it need to necessarily even come in that form at all either. Every single person on the planet can relate to some kind of experience in which they saw something or heard something, whether it was in a book or on the radio or on the internet or from a loved one or a complete stranger or on a billboard, in which there was a moment inside them that pinged and said, wait a minute, there's something about that that is meaningful and true, and I know it in my bones. Most fundamentally, the only prerequisite for guidance is willingness. And the most fertile ground in which that guidance can be connected to is the ground of peacefulness, because that guidance comes from peace. And so when we connect with our own peace, we are far more able and willing to connect with something that guides us. And so, as is so often the case in so many aspects of the spiritual journey, or what we could just as easily call the human journey, it's when we connect with our own peace that we connect with that guidance. And it's when all of our fear patterns are running rampant that we find it so difficult to connect with that guidance. That fear can come in just, a literally infinite number of forms. But that peace is always going to come, or that guidance is always going to come from a place of peace, which is why it is so often described as the still small voice inside. It's still and small because it comes from that peace. If it were to be loud and raucous and shrieking, it would be as though it's trying to overcome something or fight with some other aspect of us, and it will never ever do that. Peace will, or guidance will always come from a place of peace, which is why it is stronger than war. It's whether it's a war internally or it's a war externally, war tends to tear things up, and peace heals. That's why peace is stronger than war. And it's also why when we can connect with that peace, we can connect with that guidance, because ultimately that guidance is loving. And as usual, it is that lovingness that is the opposite of fear that is our fundamental truth. So when we follow that guidance, we follow truth.
What is death?
Oh, death is an absurdity that is just as ridiculous as the notion of birth in the first place. But if we had to put that in more concrete and ordinary and worldly terms, it would be that part where our fundamental being separates from what seems to be this physical incarnation. The good news is that, as is well evidenced by probably a great deal of everything that's been covered here, it's a separation from a bodily form that was itself already something that was not only corporeal, but not remotely containing the eternal truth of what someone really is. What we call death is simply the dissolution of the bodily limitation. And having gone through something like that myself for about a 36-hour period, and gotten to see what that's actually like very directly, if you can imagine being in, if someone was in tremendous pain, or if you've seen any anyone, relatives, or you yourself have felt what it's been like to be in a tremendous amount of physical pain or having a body that's failing in some way. And if you were to imagine what it was like to have all of that pain and all of that limitation of that mobility and all of it lifted so completely, and that it was lifted even to the point in which there was no sense of even being necessarily bound by gravity, even a freedom that is so difficult to conceive of most of the time in our ordinary waking lives, then that begins to approximate what the lifting of that bodily limitation could be like in experiential terms.
What is the veil of forgetting, and why do we need it?
The veil of forgetting, veil of forgetting, I think that means why would I go from what is overwhelmingly one and free and loving to something that is small, contracted, and fearful? What is the veil? And then forget that there is this somehow this underlying oneness that is so free. Why would I forget? There's a funny way in which there's a part of our mind decides that it wants to hold on to its individualness against all odds and against all, certainly all rationality. It's as though it says, I could let myself be subsumed by that oneness, and yet if I do that, I'm afraid that I will disappear in it. I will be gone. It is essentially, it is what underpins the fear of death. It's the fear of non-existence. It's the fear that this individuatedness will then disappear, and that somehow there will be no aspect of what I have been thinking of as me to even enjoy that freedom, that I will just be gone. And so we end up with this tremendous fear about letting go into that. Why would I forget that fundamental beingness, that oneness, that wholeness, that beauty? Because there's something about that allows me to hold on to this sense of individuatedness, and that has seemed to become valuable to me. In fact, by having forgotten that oneness, it makes it seem like, well, if I don't have this little bit of individuatedness, then I won't have anything. And that's where it's simply mistaken. It's misguided. Because when you let go of that separatedness and into that tremendous and overarching wholeness, well, the funny thing about wholeness is that it's whole, it's all, it contains everything. And so in that letting go, there could not possibly be a sense of loss. And that's what that small sense of self can't seem to remember.
Discuss the role of free will in a given incarnation.
These are the heavy hitting. Free will is a fascinating subject that can be tremendously valuable to pick apart. It's also one that, when we pick it apart, we end up faced with having to pick apart what is me and what's God. We're going to need to start this one over because I'm about to go down a major rabbit hole. In this seemingly very dualistic world, we have a simple dualistic choice always, and it's choosing between if we're going to meet this world from a place of fear or a place of love. We could say the same thing by saying, are we meeting this moment from a place of that oneness, that fundamental oneness, or from a place of separation? So in the infinite forms that our lives can take, we make all these decisions about all these things, but every single one of them fundamentally comes down to that binary choice. And in that, we have free will every single time. As a corollary to that, every time we make this choice between fear or love, there's a response. And if we've met that moment out of fear, it's more likely that the consequences in whatever form are going to come to us in a way that reinforces that fear. If we come to that decision or that choice point out of something loving, it's overwhelmingly likely that that's going to be reflected back to us in some way that's loving or that's peaceful or kind. So, given that we always have these moments in our lives when we may come to that moment from a place of fear, or we can do our best to choose to come to it from a place of love, one of the things that is powerful for us to remain mindful of, especially as we go down this spiritual road, is to be aware that no one here is perfect. No one is ever going to do this perfectly on this planet. And so it's a place where the spiritual rubber really meets the road when we have that opportunity to meet our own error within ourselves, because perhaps we didn't always make the perfect choice. And we have that opportunity to be kind and gentle to ourselves. And that is one of the most powerful ways that I know of to take what you could call spiritual practice off of the meditation cushion and out of the church and away from the altar, and have it be a vibrant part of every single day.
Is life on the physical plane an illusion?
Yes. Yes. However, it doesn't mean it's not something that's meaningful to us. What it shows us is that place from which we're coming. It shows us how much are we coming from that place of fear and that place of separation, or how much are we coming from a place of wholeness and lovingness, and are we seeing those kinds of consequences, or are we seeing the fearful consequences? How are we meeting all of those things? And so the fact that it is ultimately an illusion, since the fundamental reality and truth is that oneness, doesn't make it or doesn't render it a meaningless illusion. It's what gives us the opportunity. It gives us this framework in which we can have and do and be and choose in these ways that will help redirect us back to that oneness. So even if it's an illusion, it can still be profoundly meaningful to us here. It's the road that leads us back to that wholeness.
Do we create our own realities?
We do, as it flows from these choices that we make. Again, are those choices flowing from a fearful place or a fundamentally whole and loving place? That's going to determine our experience in every way. It's not hard to conceive of, I think, virtually by anyone. If someone is meeting their their world from a place of terror, then there's virtually nothing that they're going to experience that isn't terrifying. If they're meeting everything in front of their nose from a place of from that place that is overwhelmingly loving, whole, and in that sense without want, need, or fear, then how could their experience possibly be, in whatever form it takes? Whatever form it takes, how could that not be a form in which it's something that's more graceful? It's really the only greatest freedom that we have, to make those choices that bring to us the kinds of experiences that are more graceful.
Describe the life between lives.
Well, as a corollary, what happens in between lives is just as much of a sort of an illusory experience as all the rest of this, essentially. But let's put it in these terms: that if someone has let go of the limitations of the body, then the experience they might have in that kind of realm is going to be the kind of experience that is unburdened by all the burdens of the body. So other than that, the opportunities for that interim period are as infinitely diverse as anything that would be like coming into a lifetime here, just simply without those physical burdens, which is a remarkable place to play for a little while.
Are we judged or punished for our mistakes in the afterlife?
This is one of the greatest misperceptions of our separated egoic frames of reference in my way of seeing. there is no such thing as punishment from the divine. What would there be to be punished? A notion like punishment for those quote unquote sins is something that could only possibly be understood from that perspective in which separation is real and these alleged mistakes have real consequences that are terrible. And yet so much of the conversation that we've had so far points to how that's simply untrue, all of it. And so it's not as though this is even a question. It's like the entire thing is simply dismissed. So there would be no cause for judgment in the first place. If anything, I would make the distinction between that idea of punishment and simply the opportunity to redirect an error. My favorite example of that in regular, ordinary life is when someone has made a wrong turn on their way to wherever they're going. They're on their journey, they've made a wrong turn. And they have two options. They can either beat themselves in the head, metaphorically or really, and try to find the right way. Or they can simply redirect their effort to finding the right way and skip the beatings. Either way, they're pointed towards the right way. One of them has infinitely less violence involved and is without question, obviously, a kinder and gentler path. Not only that, but it's more effective overall. There is essentially nothing we can do in this life out of fear or violence or pain that we cannot essentially more effectively do out of some sense of lovingness. And it's from that point of view that it's impossible for me to imagine, any kind of vision of hell or that interim punishment. That's not how what is loving or divine could possibly operate. If it did, it wouldn't be divine.
Is there such a thing as hell?
There can't possibly be a hell in the sense of being real with a capital R. What we experience as hell could only be from our own separated natures. It is essentially our own creation, not a creation of the divine. If it were a creation of the divine again, it wouldn't be divine.
Describe the life review.
In my own case, like in the NDE and so on and so forth, there was not what you'd call a life review because all of it just was simply like a puff of smoke. It was just into the wholeness. One of the powerful opportunities in that moment of life review, which is not something that everyone's going to experience all the time or every time, but when it does, what it often offers is this sort of summary of the life in which it's all of a sudden possible, by seeing it in its totality, to see where the major blocks arose in that life. And so it offers an opportunity to have a sort of this moment of essentially self-inquiry that opens up this possibility for making a different choice next time, or for learning something from that, or for just seeing the primary forces in that life that led to the experiences that encompass that life, so that there's an opportunity to keep what's good and choose differently in the next one for what didn't work so well.
What is karma?
Karma is simply this interplay between what I'm choosing right now and that cascade of consequences. That's it. It still comes down to that really extremely simple binary formula of, am I coming from this fearful place in separation or something that's loving and coming from that place of wholeness? And what are the consequences that flow from that? Which is, the good news there is that whereas people often think of karma as something that's accrued over time and has these heavy burdens, what I'm describing, in the way I'm describing that, it's actually something that's present, it's instantaneous. And so it can be redirected presently, instantaneously. There is always a moment right here and right now, in this dimension, in this lifetime, right here, right now, to redirect that. And that is good news. Might as well take the opportunity. Here we are.
How do you define forgiveness?
Oh, that's a beautiful question. I'm going to tear up a little bit on this one. It could be particularly challenging for someone here in this world that, like all of us, has in some way experienced pain, trauma, bodily harm, to connect with that fundamental wholeness, that part of us, that aspect of our being that has in fact been untouched by all of those traumas. This is not in any way a suggestion by me to not acknowledge that there has been some form of trauma. It's just that, once again, it would also be foolish and unfortunate not to acknowledge that there's more to the story than that. And that in addition to those traumas that I can relate to myself, in addition to those, there is a deeper, larger part of the picture, a deeper part of one's being that has in fact not been touched by those traumas. And the more we can be in touch with that aspect, the more we are, you could say, automatically and naturally forgiving, because we've seen that there was no actual harm there. Nothing to forgive. The rest of the world is off the hook. God bless them.
Discuss the idea of oneness/unity and how we can apply it in our everyday lives.
So this highfalutin, out there notion of oneness and wholeness is, at its fundamental core, of course, it's lovingness. It always comes back to that. Our experience of love in this world is our deepest, most ready connection to what is whole and one. And so, in that sense, any way in which we can connect to what's loving is a direct application of the concept of oneness. If we look at it in a similar but maybe even more colorful way, if everything is really one, then there's nothing we can point to or experience. There's no other person in this experience of ours. There's no, of all the 8 billion of us here on the planet, if it's all one, then there's some way in which we are one with every person that we encounter. Like that they are literally a way, and sometimes in non-dual literature, there's this phrase that says, I am you, you are me, that sort of thing. However it's phrased, we apply it to our lives when we look at anything or anyone in our field of view, whether it's in our mind or on the street or in the car in front of us. And if we recognize that as literally an aspect of ourselves, then it becomes very natural to ask, well, would I want to treat myself in a way that was kind, gentle, forgiving, loving, or would I rather tear their head off? And so, even as a spiritual practice, to simply walk down the street, and even just as a thought exercise, to say, how would I be right in this moment, right now, if I really, really understood and believed and thought that that person walking towards me literally was a part of myself? How would I want to treat them? How would I want to treat myself? One of the beauties of that is that it does set up this dynamic that however I treat myself is probably how I'm going to treat people in the world around me. Or vice versa, how I treat them is how I'm going to treat myself. And if anyone reflects on that for a moment and lives into it, the likelihood is that they're probably going to want to up the kindness and the lovingness and the forgiveness factor. I can't imagine that there's really a better spiritual practice than that. And what could possibly be more practical than meeting the world in a way that is internally to yourself, ultimately kinder and gentler? If you want a better experience in the world, then you cannot miss by treating what is out there in the way that you'd wish to be treated, but also what is inside yourself the way you would wish it to be treated.
Where is heaven?
Heaven is that heaven is not a place. Heaven is our awareness of our deepest being and operating from the wholeness and the love that it is.
Where is God?
God is not a place. God is the best word we have for that wholeness and that oneness, and for the reality of our deepest being, not separate in any way.
Many believe we're shifting to a higher consciousness on this planet. Do you agree? And if so, can you describe this shift?
I see this place as essentially the opposite of what you might call heaven, because we keep describing heaven as like an awareness of oneness and the experience of that oneness and that sort of thing. And this is really quite uncontestably an experience of all the duality we could handle. So I don't think in terms of this place somehow evolving into that place. I think of it in terms of this just sort of being rendered illusory. And as that illusion fades, the fundamental reality is just automatically at hand. It's a way that's similar sometimes to the way people, or certainly the way I would describe that view of the body, in which it's not that I may have left the body at one moment, leaving the body over here and going somewhere else. It's that the awareness of the body was understood to have been an illusion, that bodily existence was an illusion in the first place, that fundamental beingness was never contained in that body, really. It was sort of an illusion of being contained in that body. And so the dissolution of that body is rendered irrelevant and unimportant. That fundamental being is what's vital. And in that same way, I don't think of this world as evolving into something else. It's just that in our own spiritual awareness, as that grows, we can then have the opportunity to let this three-dimensional world, this three-dimensional illusion, dissipate into the illusion that it was.
What's the most important thing you learned from your near death or other spiritually transformative experience?
In the first place, that NDE showed me that that physical body was itself essentially an illusion, that my fundamental beingness was not impacted, impugned, or harmed in any way, whether that bodily form remained or died. That alone was an insight or a revelation that took many years to reconcile and contend with. But I couldn't ignore it. And over those same years, there began to be a process of other spiritual experiences that began to repeatedly show me that internal, individuated sense of self that I carried around with me was also equally simply not true. That it too was essentially an illusory construction. if neither one of those things were true, then and it was experienced as such, then what was also experienced was that there wasn't any sense of real separation. There wasn't a self in there to be a separate self. And so it's as though the pendulum stopped, and it simply stopped on that side in which there was no sense of self. And so there came a point where that awareness that separation was untrue just sort of settled in permanently. And it was that moment, not the NDE itself, but it was that experience that utterly altered the course of life from that point forward. Because I couldn't really seriously consider the separation as true from that point forward. And so my own, or the experience of meeting anything that arose in life just changed dramatically.
What's the secret to remembering who we really are?
Any act of love that we can participate in reminds us of the deepest truth of who we really are.
What does our soul want us to know?
That our deepest being, our deepest truth, is absolutely loving and utterly unlimited in its lovingness.
Is there a positive message or message of hope you'd like to leave us with?
If you're watching this, you're probably on the right track. Keep going. If you're willing to listen within to that impulse, probably the same impulse that brought you here, you can rest assured you're going to point yourself in the right direction. And the deepest truth in you will tell you of itself. Keep going. Peace be with you.